The waves crashed softly against the glass wall of my office when the email arrived. Subject line: Monroe Family Christmas Reunion, Clearwater Bay Villa. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. Then I read the next line: all family members invited. My hand froze above the keyboard. 12 years. 12 Christmases without my name on their guest list. And now they were hosting a luxury Christmas reunion in my beachfront villa, the one I bought with the same hands they once told were useless. I leaned back in my chair, the reflection of the ocean glinting across the window. Somewhere below, the resort staff was decorating palm trees with golden lights. All family members, I whispered, almost amused. Guess they finally decided to include the ghost they buried. The December sun was soft, the kind that made the ocean look like liquid glass. From the 23rd floor of the Solara Retreats headquarters, Miami stretched wide and glittering. My office smelled faintly of jasmine and saltwater, a scent I'd chosen myself. The walls were lined with framed photographs of our resorts across Florida and the Caribbean white beaches. Coral roofs, infinity pools, spilling into turquoise horizons. I had built all of it from nothing but exhaustion and defiance. And yet one small email from the family that disowned me could still slice through years of peace like a shard of broken glass. I stared at the screen. All family members. The words mocked me in their simplicity. I'd seen them before on every invitation I never received, on the press photos where my parents smiled with the children they hadn't exiled. But this time it was different. The reunion would take place at Clearwater Bay Villa, a property I had bought 3 years earlier under the Solara brand, renovated, and turned into one of our top-tier destinations. My father, Charles Monroe, likely had no idea the villa he'd rented for his perfect Christmas belonged to the daughter he'd erased. The irony was exquisite. 12 years ago, he'd thrown me out of his mansion in Coral Gables with nothing but a suitcase and a degree he called useless. I still remembered the sound of rain hitting the marble steps as I walked away, the way my mother turned her face to the window so she wouldn't have to see me leave. I'd promised myself I'd never go back, and I hadn't. But fate had a dark sense of humor. It brought them back to me instead. The office door opened, breaking the quiet. Sienna Cruz stepped in, tablet in hand, her dark curls pulled back, eyes sharp as always. "Morning, boss," she said, pausing when she saw my face. "You look like someone just confessed a murder or won the lottery. Which one is it?" I turned the screen toward her. "You tell me." She leaned over, reading the subject line aloud. Monroe Family Christmas Reunion. Oh, God. Her eyes widened. "Please tell me this isn't your family." "It is," I said, voice even. "Apparently Christmas miracles do exist." She set the tablet down, lowering herself into the chair across from me. "Wait, the Clearwater Bay Villa. Isn't that one of ours?" I finished for her. "Part of Solara Retreats. Full ownership under the company. They booked it through an agency. They have no idea who owns it." Sienna blinked, a grin forming. "You're kidding. So your father just rented your villa for his big family reunion?" "Exactly," she whistled low. "Well, that's poetic justice if I've ever heard it." I reached for my coffee, now cold. "Let them come," I said quietly. Sienna frowned. "You're serious? You're actually going to let them stay there?" I nodded slowly, watching sunlight shimmer on the waves outside. "They want their picture-perfect Christmas, they can have it. I'll even make sure the view is spectacular." She tilted her head. "You sure that's wise? You don't owe them anything, is?" I smiled faintly. "It's not about owing, it's about seeing." "Seeing what?" "How far I've gone since they stopped looking." Sienna leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're terrifying when you sound calm." "Good," I said, standing and walking to the window. The ocean stretched wide and endless beyond the glass, the color of molten silver. A yacht cut through the horizon, leaving a foamy trail behind. "I used to think revenge was loud," I murmured. "Turns out it's just quiet satisfaction." She laughed under her breath. "You're quoting yourself now." I looked over my shoulder. "Write that down. It'll make a great tagline for our next marketing campaign." Her laughter softened the room, but beneath it, I felt the old ache stirring again, the ghost of that winter night 12 years ago when I lost everything and started over. My reflection in the glass looked older, sharper, 35, now successful, composed, maybe even intimidating. But somewhere, behind the tailored dress and the steady voice, the 23-year-old girl who stood in the rain still watched from the corner of her memory. "Do you ever think about calling them Sienna?" asked gently. "Only when I need to remind myself why I don't. Maybe they've changed." I turned fully toward her, one eyebrow raised. "People like Charles Monroe don't change. They rebrand." She hesitated, then smiled a little sadly. "Still, you could just ignore the whole thing." I said, "but where's the fun in that?" The intercom buzzed softly. My secretary's voice floated through. "Miss Monroe, the renovation team from Clearwater Bay is on line 2. Patch them in," I said, motioning to Sienna to stay. I pressed the button. "This is Isabella." A man's voice came through, cheerful and oblivious. "Morning, Miss Monroe. Just confirming final details for the Christmas event booking. The guests, the Monroe family have requested additional floral arrangements and an outdoor dining setup. Do we proceed?" "Yes," I said smoothly. "Give them everything they want. And make sure their suite overlooks the ocean." "Of course, ma'am." "Anything else?" "Just one thing." I glanced at Sienna, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Make sure the sign at the head table is labeled Owners Reserved. And leave it blank for now. I'll fill in the name myself." When the call ended, Sienna exhaled. "You're enjoying this way too much." Maybe, I admitted, but after 12 years I've earned the right to watch them walk into a home built by the daughter they erased. She picked up her tablet again, shaking her head. "You're going to need a better outfit for this reunion." "I already have one," I said, eyes fixed on the sea. "White?" The air conditioner hummed softly. Outside, gulls swooped low over the water, their wings catching the sunlight. For a long time neither of us spoke. There was no need. Finally, Sienna rose. "All right, I'll have the Clearwater team ready." "And her voice softened. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "I know," I said. "That's why this time I will." After she left, silence filled the office again, broken only by the faint sound of the waves below. I walked to the window, pressing my hand against the cool glass. The reflection that stared back was calm, almost serene. Beyond it, the sea stretched infinite, alive, indifferent. 12 Christmases had passed without a word from them. 12 years of building, growing, healing. Now the past was coming to me uninvited, unprepared, unaware. I let out a slow breath, the kind that steadied me before every business pitch, every storm. 12 years ago, I whispered to my reflection. They shut the door. The ocean glittered in response, sunlight scattering across the waves like laughter. "This Christmas," I said softly, "I'll open it for them." And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. The night I was erased didn't begin with shouting. It began with laughter, silverware against china, and the faint hum of a string quartet playing from the corner of the dining room. The Monroe family's Christmas dinner was an event my father treated like a royal banquet every year, planned down to the last candle flame. That December in 2013 was no different, except for one detail. I had something to say. The mansion glowed in warm gold light, the kind that hides cracks in walls and hearts. Guests from my father's real estate company filled the long mahogany table, sipping wine and discussing market trends between jokes that weren't funny. My mother Eleanor moved gracefully from seat to seat, smiling her perfect smile, making sure no one saw how tired her eyes looked. My brother Nathan sat beside my father, already dressed like a younger version of him. Dark suit, confident smirk, same hunger for control. His fiancée Chloe shone in sequins and superiority, twirling her champagne flute as if the world owed her attention. And then there was me, 23 years old, fresh out of college with a business degree and a dream my father would never approve of. I'd spent the day rehearsing my words over and over, believing maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. When dessert was served, I cleared my throat. "Dad," I began softly, There's something I want to share. He didn't look up from his plate. Make it quick, Isabella. We have plans after dinner. I've been researching opportunities in hospitality, I said, forcing a calm smile. I want to start my own boutique resort. Eco-friendly, community-based, something small but sustainable. The room fell quiet. For a moment, all I heard was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Then my father set down his fork, leaned back, and let out a laugh that wasn't really a laugh. You want to run a company? Yes, I said. I've been saving from my part-time jobs, and I have a potential investor. An investor? Chloe interrupted, giggling. That's adorable. What's next, Izzy? Selling lemonade on the beach, Nathan smirked, swirling his wine. Maybe she just wants to decorate rooms, Dad. She always liked playing house. My face burned. I'm serious. I know the market's changing. People want personal experiences, not just big hotels. You could stop embarrassing yourself. My father snapped, his voice cutting through the air like glass shattering. The table went still. I swallowed hard. I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm sharing an idea. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You think you can run a business. You can barely manage your own expenses. You live under my roof, eat my food, and you want to lecture me on the industry I built. I'm not lecturing you, I said quietly. I just thought you'd want to know what I'm working toward. You're 23. You should be thinking about a husband, not a business plan. A low murmur rippled through the guests. My mother's hand froze around her glass. Something inside me snapped. A husband, I said. You paid for my degree so I could marry someone richer. I studied finance, Dad. I've worked every summer since I was 16. What was that all for, then? He slammed his palm lightly against the table. The silverware rattled. Watch your tone. I'm asking a question, I said, voice shaking. If Nathan brought you the same idea, would you tell him to find a wife? Nathan laughed under his breath. Don't drag me into your little tantrum. My father's eyes darkened. If you were my son, he said slowly, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The words landed like a slap. My throat tightened, but I refused to let the tears come. Thank you, I said softly, for making it clear. Eleanor looked at me, pleading silently for me to stop, but I couldn't. You raised me to think hard work mattered, I said. But it never did it? What mattered was obedience. My father rose from his chair, tall and furious. You have no idea what it takes to build something real. You think dreams and sentiment will get you far. I built this empire with discipline, not emotion. And you lost a family in the process, I whispered. His face turned red. If you walk out that door tonight, Isabella, don't bother coming back. The sound of the clock filled the silence that followed. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. Then I guess this is where I stop pretending. Sit down, he barked. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and met his eyes one last time. Merry Christmas, Dad. The words echoed in the hall as I turned and walked away. Upstairs, my room glowed faintly from the light of the Christmas tree outside my window. I grabbed a duffel bag and filled it with clothes, my laptop, and a few books. On my dresser sat a framed photo of my mother and me at the beach years ago. I hesitated, then tucked it into the bag. When I came back downstairs, the music had stopped. Only the quiet tick of the clock accompanied my steps. My mother stood by the tree, pretending to fix an ornament. She didn't turn around when she spoke. You could apologize, she said softly. It would make things easier for everyone. Easier for him, I replied. She flinched at the truth. The front door loomed ahead. I reached for the handle, and the cold air pushed against me like resistance. My mother's voice followed, fragile and low. You don't have to leave, he told me to, I said. Her voice broke. He didn't mean it. I looked back at her, the glow of the Christmas lights reflecting in her eyes. He always means it. The wind howled when I opened the door, carrying the scent of salt and rain. A gust swept through the hallway, flickering the candles. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, sharp and final. Don't come back. The door shut with a sound I'll never forget. Outside, the rain fell hard cold against my skin. The mansion behind me glowed like a distant illusion, warm, unreachable. I walked down the driveway, my shoes sinking into the wet gravel, the night swallowing me whole. At the end of the street, I turned once more. Through the trees, I could still see the lights of the house shining like a world that had already forgotten me. By the time I reached the bus stop, I was soaked. My breath came in clouds, the cold biting deep into my chest. I dropped onto a metal bench and stared at the empty road ahead. My phone buzzed, a message from Nathan. "You brought this on yourself." I deleted it without replying. The bus arrived a few minutes later, headlights cutting through the rain. The driver gave me a tired smile as I climbed aboard, water dripping from my coat. Only 2 passengers sat inside, an old man asleep by the window and a teenage boy with headphones. I took the last seat, clutching my duffel bag. As the bus rumbled forward, I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and gray. My reflection stared back at me, eyes swollen, jaw set. I wasn't crying, not yet. I reached into my bag, pulling out my phone again. In my inbox sat one unread email from a restaurant in downtown Miami. "Congratulations, Isabella Monroe. Your application has been accepted." I exhaled shakily, half laughing, half choking on disbelief. The first small miracle of my new life. The bus rolled onto the highway, rain hammering against the roof. I looked out at the endless black sea and whispered, "All right then. Let's start over." The city skyline glimmered faintly in the distance, distant but waiting. Behind me, the house on Coral Gables grew smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead, the road curved through the darkness, leading me somewhere I couldn't yet imagine. They say Christmas is the season of miracles. Maybe that's true. Mine just began with exile. And as the bus carried me south, away from everything I'd ever known, I promised myself one thing. One day they'd see what I built from the silence they left behind. Every morning I woke before sunrise, not because I wanted to, but because survival doesn't sleep. The air in Miami was already thick and humid even at 5 a.m., and my small apartment above the bakery smelled like bread and salt and desperation. The floorboards creaked when I crossed them, the ceiling fan hummed weakly, and every sound reminded me that I wasn't home, though I wasn't sure I had one anymore. It had been 3 months since that night at the mansion. The duffel bag I'd carried out into the rain was now my closet, my storage, and sometimes my pillow. The bakery downstairs let me rent the room cheap because I cleaned up after closing, and the old Cuban woman who ran the place sometimes slipped me day-old rolls when she thought I wasn't looking. Still, I didn't feel pitied. I felt alive. My life was finally mine, even if it was hanging by a thread. My morning started at the Seabreeze Motel, a faded blue building near the shore, with a sign that buzzed when the wind hit it right. Paint peeled from the doors, the vending machine 8 quarters, and the front desk computer still used dial-up internet. But it was steady work, and I was learning more there than any classroom had ever taught me. By 7, I was behind the front desk in my wrinkled uniform, hair tied back, smile ready. I checked in fishermen, retirees, and sunburned tourists who complained about the price of orange juice. The owner, Mr. Patel, was a small man with sharp eyes and a soft heart. He taught me how to balance the books, negotiate with suppliers, and calm angry guests. "Business," he'd say, tapping his temple, "is not numbers, it's patience." He noticed how quickly I learned, how I stayed late to fix the jammed printer or repaint the porch railing. One day, while I was mopping the lobby floor, he said quietly, "You could run a place like this one day." I smiled at the reflection in the glass door. "Maybe one better," he laughed. "Dreams cost money." "I'm saving," I said, though. The coins in my jar barely made a sound when I shook it. By late afternoon, I'd trade the motel's salty breeze for the greasy hum of the Silver Lantern Diner on Kelsey Avenue. The smell of fried onions clung to my hair, and my feet ached by the end of every shift. But the people there were real truck drivers, waitresses, janitors, the kind of souls who didn't judge a person for the name stitched on their apron. That's where I met her, Mrs. Alvarez. She sat at the same booth every evening near the window, with a stack of travel magazines and a single cup of tea. She was in her 60s, elegant but unpretentious, with silver hair pinned neatly and eyes that noticed everything. "You always look like you're chasing something," she told me one night as I refilled her cup. "Maybe I am," I said. She smiled a little sadly. "I used to manage hotels once. I can tell when someone's born for it." That caught me off guard. "You did?" She nodded. "Ran a small chain on the coast with my husband before he passed. Sold everything after. But the thing about hospitality, dear, it never leaves your bones." That night, she stayed later than usual, and we talked between my rounds of cleaning tables. I told her I wanted to build something of my own someday. Something small, beautiful, warm, a place that made people feel safe. "You mean a resort?" she asked. "More like a home for travelers," I said, smiling at the sound of it. "A home that doesn't judge who walks through the door." She studied me for a long moment, then said softly, "Then start learning how to make people feel that way even here." After she left, I wrote her words down in a small notebook I'd started carrying. On the first page, in shaky ink, I wrote one word: Solara. It meant sunlight. I wanted my future to feel like that bright cleansing, impossible to ignore. At night, in the small hours between exhaustion and sleep, I'd sketch designs in that notebook. I drew bungalows surrounded by palm trees, beach paths, lined with lanterns and open kitchens, where strangers could share food like family. I taped the sketches above my bed, just above the line I'd written in black marker, "When they close the door, build your own house." Some nights I believed it. Some nights I cried until I didn't. The summer heat came early that year. The Seabreeze Motel lost its air conditioning, and I worked 3 days straight helping Mr. Patel keep guests calm with complimentary popsicles and half-price rates. Then, without warning, he told us he was selling the property. "I'm sorry, Isabella," he said kindly. "You're the best worker I've had, but it's time to retire." He handed me a recommendation letter written in careful cursive. I thanked him, smiled, and walked to the beach before the tears came. I kept the letter in my bag, pressed flat like a lifeline. The next day, I added another shift at the diner. I needed the money. My hands smelled of bleach and fryer oil, but every paycheck meant another line in my notebook, another step closer to Solara. Then came the night that changed everything. It was near closing, just past midnight, when a customer started shouting at me over a wrong order. He was drunk, loud, the kind of man who enjoyed watching others shrink. "Can't even get a burger right," he sneered. "Figures. You look like someone who dropped out of college." My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. I set the plate down calmly and said, "Sir, you're welcome to leave if you're unhappy," he smirked. "What are you gonna do?" "Fire me," I leaned in, voice low but steady. "No, but I'll remember you when I own the place." The table behind him burst out laughing. He went quiet, red-faced, muttered something, and left. When I turned around, Mrs. Alvarez was smiling at me from her booth. "You've got a tongue made of steel," she said softly. "I've been practicing," I told her. She chuckled, then reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table. "You should come to this," she said. Inside was a flyer for a hospitality conference in Tampa, 2 weeks away. "I can't afford that," I said. She waved a hand. "Don't worry about the fee. I still have friends in the industry. I can get you in." I hesitated. "I can't even afford the bus." She took out a folded $50 bill and tucked it into my pocket. "Consider it a down payment on your destiny." I laughed, trying not to cry. "Why are you helping me?" "Because once upon a time," she said, "someone did the same for me. Don't waste it." That night, I packed my old duffel bag again. Inside went my motel uniform, my diner apron, Mr. Patel's letter, and the Solara notebook. I barely slept, afraid the morning would talk me out of it. When dawn broke, the sky turned gold over Biscayne Bay. I walked to the bus, stopped, the air salty, and soft, the streets almost empty. As I boarded, I found a window seat and watched Miami fade behind me. The palm trees, the neon diners, the horizon lined with cranes and half-built dreams. Mrs. Alvarez's words echoed in my head, "Dreams don't leave your bones." The bus hummed along the highway, cutting through the brightness of the rising Sunday. I opened the notebook and traced the word Solara with my thumb. For the first time since that night I left home, I wasn't running from anything. I was moving toward something. When the ocean came back into view, endless and shimmering, I whispered to myself, "This is where Solara begins." And in that moment, I believed it. The Tampa conference smelled like ambition and perfume. The hotel ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, every table draped in white linen and brochures. Men in sharp suits moved between panels like sharks scenting opportunity. I stood near the registration desk, clutching my borrowed badge, trying not to look like someone who'd arrived on a $40 bus ticket with exactly $12 left to her name. Mrs. Alvarez had kept her promise. She'd called one of her old contacts, a retired hospitality investor named Lance Whitmore, and somehow convinced him to put my name on the guest list. I still didn't know why she'd done it, but I wasn't going to waste it. "Miss Monroe," a voice said behind me. I turned to find a tall man in his mid-50s, gray hair at the temples, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. "Lance Whitmore," he said, offering his hand. "Thank you for letting me be here," I said. He smiled slightly. "Alvarez speaks highly of you, says you remind her of herself minus the cigarettes and bad decisions." I laughed awkwardly. "That's a compliment, I think." He gestured toward the conference floor. "Come on, let's walk." We drifted through a maze of exhibitors, software vendors, interior designers, real estate brokers. He asked sharp, precise questions about what I'd noticed since arriving, what I thought. Small resorts lacked what travelers wanted but couldn't find. I answered honestly, not strategically. "They want authenticity," I said. "They want warmth. Not another marble lobby with staff who don't remember their names. I'd build something where people feel like they're visiting friends, not customers." He stopped walking. "And you'd call it Solara," I said softly. "It means light." He studied me for a moment that felt like forever. Then he nodded once. "Come to dinner tonight. No pitch deck, no presentation. Just conversation." Dinner was in a quiet corner of the hotel restaurant. Lance ordered wine I couldn't pronounce. I ordered water, afraid to spill anything expensive. He asked about my past, the family business, the argument, the reason I left. I told him the truth in pieces, enough to paint the picture without showing the bruises. "So, your father runs Monroe Estates?" he asked. "Still does," I said. "He's good at building houses. I just wanted to build something that felt like home." Lance leaned back. "You've got fire, kid. But fire needs fuel. What do you have besides a dream?" "And $12 a notebook," I said, pulling it from my bag. I flipped through sketches, bungalows, open kitchens, ocean views drawn in pencil. "And maybe a little faith." He took the notebook, turned a few pages, and smiled. "Faith can be collateral when you've got the right kind of persistence." When the check came, he waved the waiter away. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a challenge." "What kind of challenge?" He tore a small piece of paper from his planner, scribbled something, and slid it across the table. "An address. There's an old lodge site outside Key Largo. Abandoned, water damaged, worthless to most people. If you can make me believe it's worth saving, I'll fund the first phase." I stared at the paper. "That's not exactly a contract. It's not exactly a promise either," he said. "Meet me there in 2 weeks." The following morning, I was on another bus, this time heading south. The road stretched along the ocean, sunlight bouncing off the waves like broken glass. The old Coral Bay Lodge sat at the end of a dirt road lined with mangroves. The sign out front hung crooked, half-rusted. The roof sagged, the windows were boarded up, and seaweed clung to the foundation like forgotten memories. I should have felt overwhelmed. Instead, I felt alive. I walked through the cracked doorway, kicking up sand and dust. The air smelled of salt wood, rot, and time. But when I looked beyond the decay, I saw something else, the light pouring through the broken roof, the sea shimmering just beyond the porch, the way the wind moved through the empty rooms, as if waiting for someone to return. I spent 3 days there, sketching, measuring, taking pictures, talking to locals who remembered when it had been full of laughter and music. One man, a retired fisherman named Raoul, said quietly, "People used to come here to start over. Maybe it's waiting for you to do the same." When Lance arrived that weekend, I was barefoot, hair tied up, paint on my jeans, surrounded by a mess of blueprints and coffee cups. He walked through the ruins, slowly nodding at the exposed beams, the open view of the ocean. So he said, "Do you see potential or just nostalgia?" "Both," I said. "But nostalgia sells rooms. Potential builds futures." He smiled. "You rehearsed that line." "I didn't need to," I replied. "It's true." We walked the property together as the tide came in. I told him my plans start small. 10 rooms, use local wood solar panels, repurpose the dock for sunset dinners, make it intimate, sustainable, human. When we reached the edge of the water, he pulled out his phone, made a brief call, and said, "It's yours for now. My lawyer will draw up the papers. Consider this an investment in stubbornness." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. "You're serious?" As serious as a man about to risk his retirement fund on a stranger with paint in her hair. I laughed until my voice cracked. He just smiled, handed me a folder, and said, "Don't thank me yet. It's harder than you think to build light." The months that followed were brutal. I slept in a trailer on site, woke at dawn to the sound of gulls, and spent my days scraping salt from old walls. I hired anyone who believed in the dream: carpenters, local teens, a chef named Liam Porter who'd been out of work since his restaurant closed. We painted, hammered, and rebuilt with our bare hands. When the rain came, we worked under tarps. When the funds ran low, I skipped meals. Some nights I cried quietly in the dark, the sound swallowed by the wind. But every morning when the first light hit the water, I remembered why I'd started. By the end of the year, the Coral Bay Lodge wasn't a ruin anymore. It was alive again, reborn as Solara Retreat. 10 rooms, a small kitchen, a lobby that smelled of cedar and coffee, and a porch overlooking the sea. Our first guests weren't influencers or investors. They were families stranded by a sudden storm, travelers who'd lost their way. We offered soup, blankets, and stories. The next morning, one of them said with tears in her eyes, "This place feels like home." That was the moment I knew Solara would survive. Word spread faster than I expected. A travel blogger stayed for 2 nights and wrote an article titled "The Little Lodge That Refused to Die." Within weeks, bookings doubled. By spring, we were full. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the ocean, Lance returned. He stood at the edge of the porch, watching guests laugh over dinner, the golden light spilling through the open doors. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did," I corrected. He studied me. "Your father will hear about this." I met his eyes. "Good, let him." He smiled faintly. "He won't like it. Then he shouldn't have underestimated me." Lance chuckled, shaking his head. "You really are her student, Alvarez's spirit in a younger body." "She taught me something," I said. "When people push you out, build a door big enough for them to walk back through. Whether they ever do is their choice." That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone on the beach. The air was cool, the stars endless. I thought of my father's words. "If you walk out that door, don't come back." I smiled to myself. "I didn't," I whispered. "You did." The tide crept closer, washing over my feet, and for the first time since I left home, the water didn't feel cold. It felt like a beginning. By the winter of 2019, Solara was no longer just a dream stitched together by calloused hands and sleepless nights. It was a living, breathing story, one that hummed with the laughter of guests and the steady rhythm of waves breaking against the pier. The smell of cedar and salt air hung everywhere, woven into the wood like memory. I'd opened 2 new branches that year, one in Clearwater Bay and another in the Florida Keys, each one carrying a piece of the first Solara's warmth. The media called me the woman who built light. I pretended not to care, but every headline felt like a quiet echo of the name my father used to say, only with disappointment. Sometimes I'd read the articles alone late at night sipping tea, wondering if he'd seen them, if his jaw had tightened the way it used to when he was proven wrong. The truth was, I didn't build Solara to prove anything to him. I built it to prove something to myself, that I could create beauty from what he called failure. Still, pride is a tricky thing. It hides in your chest until the day it starts to burn. That December morning, I sat in my Clearwater office, glass walls opening to a horizon of gold water and white sand. Guests drifted below like figures from another life, carefree and sun-soaked. Beside me, Grace Donovan, my newly appointed event director, stood with her tablet rattling through the schedule. "We've got the Valentine's retreat in February, the investor brunch next week, and the Miami press tour after that," she said. Her tone was brisk but warm, like someone who cared too much to sound impressed. "And the staff holiday dinner?" I asked. "Confirmed. Everyone's excited." "Liam's making his famous citrus roast again," I smiled. "He's been threatening to put that on the permanent menu." "He should," Grace said. "It's better than half the five-star nonsense I've tasted." She turned to go, but paused at the door. "You ever think about how far you've come as her? Use of that nickname, the one my family used to say like it was a sigh, made me pause." "Sometimes," I said quietly, "but usually I'm just thinking about what's next." After she left, the silence pressed in. The sound of waves outside the glass was the same rhythm that had carried me since that night I walked out of my father's house. I had everything now: success, respect, peace. Or at least that's what everyone assumed. The phone buzzed. "A message from Lance, dinner tonight. Got news." We met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the bay. He ordered red wine, I ordered the sea bass. After we traded pleasantries, he set his glass down and leaned in slightly. "You've built something remarkable, Isabella," he said. "But I want you to be careful." Careful of what? He sighed. "There's a man named Victor Langford, runs Langford Holdings. He's been buying up independent resorts left and right. Doesn't like competition. You're getting too big for his liking." I raised an eyebrow. "He can buy property. He can't buy pride." Lance gave a dry laugh. "That's exactly what I said before I lost 2 hotels to him. Pride doesn't pay lawyers, and it sure doesn't keep sharks from circling." "I'm not afraid of sharks," I said. He studied me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You sound more like your father every year." The comment hit harder than he knew. I laughed to mask it, but my stomach twisted. "Let's hope not." After dinner, I drove back to the villa. The resort glowed softly in the distance, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and sea spray. I walked the property barefoot, my heels dangling from my hand. Lights flickered in the guest rooms, laughter drifted from the bar, and for a moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment without fear. I stopped by the front desk where a new couple was checking in. The man handed over his credit card, his wife clinging to his arm, both of them flushed from the flight. I smiled at them, remembering the early days when every guest felt like a miracle. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass, confident, composed, and utterly alone. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl who'd left home in the rain. She was something sharper, quieter, forged in flame. The next morning, the Clearwater branch opened its new ballroom, a vast space lined with glass panels that looked straight onto the ocean. The staff buzzed with excitement, photographers snapping shots for travel magazines. When the ribbon was cut, applause echoed against the walls. For a moment, I let myself imagine the kind of celebration my father would have thrown for Nathan if he'd achieved something like this. That thought made me laugh quietly. After the ceremony, Liam found me near the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Place looks good, boss," he said. "Almost too good." "Too good?" I asked. He grinned. "It's dangerous. People get jealous when you make it look this easy." "I've learned jealousy's just admiration wearing a bad disguise." He laughed. "That should be printed on a t-shirt." As the day faded into evening, I climbed to the balcony above the ballroom. From up there, I could see everything: the guests, the tables, the flicker of candles on glass, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond. That view used to make me feel small. Now it reminded me how far I'd come. Every tile, every wall, every inch of marble existed because I refused to accept exile as the end of my story. But success, like the tide, always brings something back with it. That night, while reviewing invoices in my office, I received an unexpected call. Isabella. The voice was female young professional. This is Olivia Trent from Financial Weekly. We're running a feature on female entrepreneurs, redefining the resort industry. I'd love to interview you. I hesitated. I hated interviews, especially ones that like to dig into the past. We can focus purely on business, she added quickly, as if reading my silence. No personal questions. I exhaled. All right, next week. Clearwater Bay. Perfect, she said. And congratulations, Miss Monroe. Solara is a phenomenon. After hanging up, I stared out at the dark sea beyond the glass. My reflection shimmered faintly against the water, half ghost, half survivor. Somewhere far away, I wondered if my father was reading the same magazine that now carried my name. Would he recognize me? Would he even care? The waves rolled in steady and indifferent. The moonlight spilled across the sand like silver paint. I pressed my hand against the cold window and whispered to the darkness. You taught me to survive storms, Dad. You just never expected me to build a harbor. The next morning I woke to rain tapping against the glass roof. The air smelled clean new. I poured coffee, watched the horizon disappear behind mist, and smiled to myself. Solara was thriving, my staff was family, my investors were loyal. And my name was no longer a shadow of his. Still, somewhere deep inside I could feel it, the quiet pull of something unfinished, like the tide creeping in before a storm. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret, it was anticipation. Because I knew sooner or later the past always finds its way home. December had always been my favorite month. Even when I was a child, it wasn't because of the gifts or the decorations. It was the stillness, the way the world seemed to pause before beginning again. Now, years later, that stillness felt like a lie. It was early morning in Clearwater Bay, the resort humming with soft carols and clinking glasses from the breakfast terrace below. The air smelled of pine, cinnamon, and salt. I was reviewing contracts at my desk when Sienna burst through the door, breathless and red-cheeked from the cold. You're not going to believe this, she said, clutching her tablet like it might explode. I didn't look up. If it's another influencer demanding a free suite, tell them we're booked through March. It's not that. She stepped closer. It's your family. The pen slipped from my hand. What about them? She hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue. There's been a new booking. 6 premium suites, 5 nights. December 23rd through the 28th. That's Christmas week, she nodded. And they paid in full. Corporate card. Guess whose name's on it? My stomach tightened. Say it. Charles Monroe, Monroe Estates. For a moment the room went quiet except for the hum of the heater. Outside, the sky had turned the color of cold gold sunlight breaking over the water. I reached for the tablet, scanning the reservation details. The name glared back at me like a ghost from another lifetime. They're coming here, she whispered. To Clearwater Bay. I leaned back, letting the words sink in. They don't know who owns it, I said. She shook her head. No. The booking came through the central office in Miami. They probably think it's just another luxury villa. I almost laughed. The sound that came out was half amusement, half disbelief. Of course they don't. Why would they? They never looked back long enough to see how far I'd gone. Sienna's brow furrowed. You don't have to let them stay here, we can cancel, refund, redirect, whatever you want. I stood walking to the window. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, the waves catching the sunlight like sheets of glass. No, I said softly. Let them come. She blinked. What they want, their perfect Christmas reunion. Let them have it right here, surrounded by everything they said I'd never build. Sienna stared at me, torn between shock and admiration. You're serious. I smiled faintly. Completely. Make sure their rooms are in the ocean view wing, the best side of the resort, the most expensive side. I know, I said. I want them to see the view. Sienna hesitated. Are you sure this is healthy? You've worked too hard to? This isn't about revenge, I interrupted. It's about balance. She sighed, defeated but loyal. Fine, I'll confirm the booking. But for the record, you're terrifying when you're calm. When she left, the silence returned heavy and deliberate. I stood by the glass watching the waves roll toward the shore. I could almost see them, my father's precise stride, my mother's nervous smile, Nathan's polished charm, Chloe's expensive perfume. They'd walk through the lobby expecting the world to bend for them. And for once it would, but on my terms. The phone buzzed on my desk. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something instinct curiosity fate made me pick up. Hello, a pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. Hey, I froze. Nathan. He laughed softly, uncertain. Yeah. I wasn't sure this number still worked. It does, I said, forcing my tone steady. I heard you're in Florida. We're, heading down for the reunion. Clearwater Bay. You know it. I looked out at the beach stretching below my office window. I might have heard of it. He hesitated. You should come. Mom would like that. I'll be there, I said. Really, his surprise was genuine. Yes, I replied. Trust me, Nathan. I'll be there. There was a silence, the kind that used to mean we understood each other. Now it felt like a canyon. Okay then, he said finally. See you soon. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time. 12 years of silence, and he'd spoken to me like nothing had happened. Maybe that was the real curse of family. They could forget the wars they started and call it peace. That afternoon, I gathered my senior staff, Grace, Liam, and Sienna, into the conference room. The air buzzed with tension. I know this is short notice, I began, but we'll have special guests arriving next week. The Monroe family. Grace raised an eyebrow. Your family, my former family, I corrected. They don't know I own the resort. Let's keep it that way. Sienna leaned forward. What exactly do you want us to do? Treat them like every other guest. Professional, polite, no special treatment. I paused, then added, except one thing. Liam folded his arms. Here it comes. At the Christmas gala, I said the main table will have a nameplate that reads Owner the Forgotten Sister. Grace's jaw dropped. That's poetic. Accurate, I replied. Sienna looked both horrified and impressed. You're planning something, aren't you? Not planning, I said. Watching. Sometimes the best revenge is letting people see the truth on their own. When the meeting ended, the sun had begun to set over the ocean, streaking the sky with pink and orange. The resort glowed under strings of lights, laughter echoing from the courtyard below. I stood at my office window again, glass of wine in hand, watching the tide creep in. The phone buzzed once more, a new email. From Olivia Trent, Financial Weekly. The subject line read, Feature Opportunity, Women Redefining Hospitality. I opened it slowly. Dear Miss Monroe, we'd love to film a short interview at Solara Clearwater Bay next week as part of our year-end series. Your work has redefined the modern resort model. I smiled faintly. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Sienna appeared in the doorway again as if summoned by my thoughts. More press, Olivia Trent, I said. She wants an interview. She's good. Big audience. Too big, I murmured. But maybe that's exactly what I need. Sienna frowned. You're not seriously going to let her film while your family's here? I looked at her reflection beside mine in the window. Why not let the world see what they've ignored? Isabella, she began carefully. This could get messy. I turned from the window, smiling calmly. Messy is how you find out who's still standing. When she left, I sat down again, staring at the reflection of the sea against the glass. My pulse was steady, but something inside me trembled, the place where old wounds hide just under the surface. I picked up my phone and typed a reply. I'm in. See you next week. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of Christmas carols from the courtyard. The world looked peaceful, but I knew better. 12 years ago, they sent me into the cold. Now they were walking straight into my warmth, unaware that the fire had always been mine to command. I raised my glass toward the horizon, whispering to the waves, "Let the season of miracles begin." And for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like the storm. The headline hit like a storm at dawn. From exile to empire, the disowned daughter, behind Solara retreats. I found the newspaper on my desk when I arrived that morning, folded neatly beside a cup of coffee I hadn't ordered. Sienna stood near the window, pale and tight-lipped, her phone buzzing every few seconds. "You're on the front page," she said quietly. I picked up the paper. My own face stared back at me, a photo from last month's award gala, smiling, composed, untouchable. Beneath it, a smaller image of my father shaking hands at a real estate conference. The caption read, "Charles Monroe, architect of the empire that once excluded his daughter." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I laughed softly, not out of humor but disbelief. They promised business, not biography. Sienna crossed her arms. "Olivia Trent wrote the piece, but it looks like her editor went off script. The article's everywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn, even the morning shows are quoting it." I skimmed the lines. Every paragraph bled with precision facts. I hadn't shared pieces of my life I'd kept buried. The story painted me as a phoenix, a woman who rose from the ashes of betrayal to build an empire of light. It mentioned Monroe Estates, my father, the night I walked out of that house. It stopped short of naming names, but anyone who knew him could read between the lines. Sienna read from her phone. "Number forgotten daughter is trending. And people are obsessed with you. Look." She held up a post. It showed the photo of Solara's grand staircase with the caption, "Built by the woman her father tried to erase." I set the paper down, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. So much for silence. She hesitated. "Are you angry?" I stared out the window at the waves, steady and endless. "No. Just surprised. The truth makes better headlines than lies." By noon, the calls started. Reporters, investors, people I hadn't heard from in years. Even Lance left a voicemail that said, "Only call me before you say anything." I didn't, because I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that story in my father's world. In some glossy office tower in Miami, Charles Monroe was probably holding that same newspaper, his jaw tightening with every line. I could picture him perfectly, coffee, half-drunk, phone ringing off the hook, his pride bleeding into the marble floor. He'd tell his assistant to cancel his meetings. He'd call my brother. He'd call his lawyer. And he'd say the same thing he always did when the world stopped listening to him. "She's tarnishing this family's name." And my mother would stand at the window, hands trembling around her cup of tea, whispering, "Maybe she's just telling the truth." The thought made me smile. By 3 o'clock, the damage was irreversible. The article had gone global. Financial Today called it the most read feature of the season. Olivia sent me a message apologizing, claiming she hadn't expected her editor to run it without final approval. It's good publicity, she'd written, even if it's personal. Publicity built on wounds I thought isn't good for anyone. I closed my laptop and walked down to the beach. The sky was gray, the horizon blurred by rain. The tide crept over my feet, cold and insistent. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who'd walked out of her father's house into another December storm. 12 years later, here I was again, standing in the same wind, only now the house was his, and the storm was mine. When I returned to the office, Sienna was waiting with a folder. "Before you say anything, you need to see this." The cover bore a logo I recognized instantly, Langford Holdings. "Another resort deal?" I asked. "Not exactly." She handed it to me. "It's an acquisition proposal. They're offering to buy out Solara Retreats. Full ownership. You keep a ceremonial title, but they'd own everything." I flipped through the pages, scanning the fine print. When I reached the signature line, my chest went cold. "Tell me I'm seeing this wrong," I said. Sienna swallowed. "You're not." There it was in blue ink, his name crisp and familiar. Charles Monroe, Senior Advisor, Langford Holdings. The silence that followed was heavy enough to break glass. He's trying to buy me out, I said finally. Technically, it's Langford Sienna offered weekly. Don't, I snapped. He signed it. That means he knows exactly what he's doing. Sienna hesitated. Maybe he's just angry, trying to regain control. That's all he's ever done. I closed the folder. Control the narrative. Control the people. Control me. The phone on my desk buzzed again, unknown number. I didn't answer. Should I call the lawyers? Sienna asked. No, not yet. Then what are you going to do? I looked out at the sea, its surface rippling like a mirror. Remind my father who he raised. That night the rain returned. I sat alone in my office with a glass of wine, the contract spread out before me. The ink on his signature shimmered faintly under the desk lamp. I traced the letters with my thumb the same way I used to trace the blueprints of his buildings when I was a child. He used to say handwriting was the reflection of the soul. Steady lines meant discipline, curved ones meant compassion. His was rigid, flawless, without mercy. The phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up. Voicemail. His voice. Calm, controlled. Deadly familiar. You've made your point, Isabella. Don't ruin what you've built trying to embarrass me. I listened twice, then deleted it. By morning, I had a plan. Rachel Klein, my corporate attorney, met me at sunrise. Her dark hair was tied back, her tone crisp as always. They're smart, she said, flipping through the Langford documents, used 3 shell companies to mask the acquisition trail. But they missed something. I leaned forward. What, the right of first refusal clause you wrote into Solara's original incorporation papers? It gives you the power to block any external sale or transfer without your consent. A slow smile spread across my face. I wrote that clause myself. Rachel returned the smile. Then you already know what to do. We filed the preemptive notice that afternoon. 1 digital signature, 1 confirmation email, and the entire acquisition froze. By 5 o'clock, I received the notification, purchase suspended pending owner response. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I laughed, a quiet, disbelieving sound that felt like victory. Sienna found me in the doorway minutes later. Did it work? It did, I said. They can't touch us. Her shoulders sagged with relief. He's going to call you, no. I hope he does. Later that night, as the sky darkened over Clearwater Bay, I sat by the window watching lightning flicker across the water. My phone vibrated 3 times in a row, Langford Development private number, and finally Charles Monroe. I let them all go to voicemail. When the last ring faded, I raised my glass and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Dad. You taught me to play the game. You just never imagined I'd win it." Outside, the sea raged and the wind howled, but inside the world was still. For 12 years, I'd been the daughter exiled by silence. Now silence was the weapon I wielded best. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the resort drenched in sunlight that glinted across the wet glass like spilled gold. I sat in the conference room, barefoot, coffee, untouched papers spread out in front of me. The air still smelled faintly of rain and sea salt. Rachel Klein stood near the window, flipping through the stack of documents she'd printed at dawn. Grace and Sienna waited across the table, their eyes darting between us. "They thought they could blindside you," Rachel said, tapping the Langford folder with a manicured finger. "But the right of first refusal clause shut them down." Brilliant, by the way. Most founders don't think ahead that far. "I wasn't thinking ahead," I said quietly. "I was thinking about survival." Sienna leaned forward. "So, they can't buy us?" "Not without her signature," Rachel said. "And she's not giving it." Grace exhaled loudly. "Thank God. I've seen what happens when Langford gets their claws in something. They gut it, strip it, and sell it like it never had a soul. That's what my father wanted," I said. "A shell with his name on it." Rachel closed the folder. "Well, he can't have it. I'll file a preemptive notice today to make sure this deal doesn't resurrect under another alias." "Good," I said, pushing back my chair. "Let them feel safe for a day or 2. Confidence makes people sloppy." Rachel smirked. "I like the way you think." After she left, the 3 of us sat in silence, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound between us. Sienna finally broke it. You look too calm for someone who just shut down a multi-million-dollar acquisition. I'm not calm, I said, staring out the glass wall at the ocean. I'm calculating. Grace rubbed her temples. You really want them to come here next week, don't you? Yes, I said, simply. They booked my house for their perfect Christmas reunion. Let them enjoy it. Enjoy it, Grace repeated. You're inviting an emotional hurricane. I turned toward her, smiling faintly. Hurricanes built this place. I can handle one more. She didn't argue, just nodded, understanding there was no changing my mind. Later that afternoon, I found Grace in the event hall adjusting garlands. The ballroom shimmered with winter light, the air scented with eucalyptus and polished wood. She was standing on a chair, her long braids swinging as she reached for the highest beam. Careful, I called. I need you alive for the gala. She laughed, climbing down. Force of habit. When you've rebuilt a life, you start believing you can fix anything with your hands. Her words caught me off guard. You sound like someone who knows. She hesitated, eyes softening. My ex-husband used to tell me I was lucky he kept me. Said no one else would put up with me and my daughter. When he left, I thought he took everything. Turns out he just freed the space for better things. I looked at her. He sounds like someone who doesn't understand value. She smiled faintly. He didn't. But you did. You gave me this job when no one else would. You didn't just build a resort, you built second chances. Her voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I saw a reflection of myself, someone who'd been broken open but rebuilt stronger. I reached for her shoulder. You don't owe me anything, Grace. Just promise me you'll never let anyone make you smaller again. She nodded, blinking back tears. You too. That night, when the resort quieted, I stayed in the conference room long after everyone had gone. The ocean shimmered dark and silver through the glass. I spread the documents across the table, Langford's proposal, the legal filings, my father's signature staring back at me like a ghost. I didn't need to open the folder again, but I did. I traced the elegant blue lines of his name, the same signature he used when he signed my college acceptance papers, when he signed the deed to our first house, when he signed my exile. He used to tell me penmanship revealed a person's soul. His was flawless, cold, impersonal, the script of a man who'd never doubted his authority. Mine was sharper now, firmer. I signed the counter notice, the final piece that made it legally binding. The pen scratched softly across the paper, sealing everything. Sienna walked in just as I capped it. That's it, I said. Acquisition suspended. Solara remains independent. She leaned against the doorframe. He's going to call. I know. And you're not going to answer. Not until he understands that silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. She studied me for a moment. You scare me sometimes. Don't be scared, I said. Be patient. Justice is quieter than people think. When she left, I poured a glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of night that made the sea smell almost sweet. Below, the lights of the resort glowed in gold reflections across the water. Guests laughed near the fire pit, their voices blending with the steady hush of waves. For a while, I let myself breathe. Then my phone buzzed. A New York number. I didn't have to answer to know it was them. Across the country, in some glossy high-rise, Victor Langford and Charles Monroe would be staring at their own screens, realizing that the deal they thought was theirs had frozen. I could almost hear the conversation, the rising tension, the disbelief. What do you mean it's blocked? The owner exercised her right of refusal. Who? A pause. Isabella Monroe. I smiled at the sound. I imagined next silence thick enough to taste. In my mind, I saw my father's face red with fury, his voice tight. She can't do that. Oh, but I could. And I had. Hours later, I finally shut down, my computer exhaustion settling into my bones. But before I could sleep, I opened the old Solara notebook, the same one I'd carried from Miami years ago. On the first page, beneath faded pencil sketches, I'd once written a promise: when they close the door, build your own house. I smiled at the irony. The house was built, and now they were the ones asking to come in. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass. I poured the last of the wine, lifted it toward the horizon, and murmured, "Here's to every daughter they thought would stay silent." The next day arrived, clear and sharp sunlight spilling through the office like honey. I wore white not for peace, but for power. Sienna stood by the door, tablet in hand, eyes flicking nervously toward my phone. "It's been ringing all morning," she said. "I know. You're really not going to answer him." "No," I said. "Let him feel what absence sounds like." By evening, the horizon began to darken. The sky shifted to indigo, the sea glowing like liquid glass. I sat at my desk, the final email confirmation glowing on the screen. Notice successfully filed. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The tension I'd carried for days began to unravel, replaced by something sharper: resolve. When the phone buzzed again, I turned it face down. He had once taught me that silence was weakness. He was wrong. Silence was armor. Outside, the resort lights flickered to life one by one, reflections rippling across the water like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled faintly over the sea, a reminder that every storm eventually circles back. I stood, lifted my glass again, and whispered to the quiet room, "Let them come. I'm ready this time." The wind picked up, brushing against the open balcony doors, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. I closed my eyes, let it fill the space around me, and smiled. The calm before a reckoning always smelled this sweet. The call came just after dawn, when the light was still gray and the sea outside my window hadn't yet turned blue. The phone buzzed on my desk, steady and insistent, the name glowing on the screen like an omen. Charles Monroe, my father. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello," his voice was calm, too calm. "We need to talk." "We are talking. In person," he said. 10 minutes. He hung up before I could answer. I stared at the phone for a moment, the air in the room suddenly too thin. Then I glanced at the clock, 7:20 a.m. By 7:30 he'd be standing in my lobby. Sienna appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand. "You okay? You look like you just saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," I said, standing. "Just the man who used to haunt me." When the elevator chimed 10 minutes later, I didn't stand to greet him. I wanted him to see it, the glass walls, the gold light, the empire he said I'd never build. He stepped into my office wearing his usual armor, a tailored coat, silver cufflinks, that quiet, heavy air of control. But his eyes hesitated, scanning the room, taking in the Solara logo cut into the steel behind my desk. "All of this," he said, slowly, "is yours." I met his gaze. "Every inch." He gave a short laugh, not one of amusement, but disbelief. "You think this proves something? I don't have to think it," I said. "I know it." He walked closer, folding his hands behind his back the same way he used to when delivering a lecture. "You always had potential, Isabella. You just refused to learn." "Learn what?" I asked quietly. "How the world works," he said sharply. "It doesn't reward emotion, it rewards control." I rose from my chair, meeting his eyes. "Then you should be very proud, because you taught me both." He flinched almost imperceptibly, then gestured toward the window. "You think this resort, this empire means you've won. This isn't a competition," I said. "It's balance. You threw me out into the cold. I built warmth." He frowned. "You make it sound noble. What you did was reckless. What I did was survive." The silence that followed stretched tight between us. Outside, gulls cried over the water, and somewhere in the distance a bell chimed from the dock. He broke the silence first. "You embarrassed this family." "That article? What the hell were you thinking? Letting those vultures write about us?" I tilted my head. "You mean the truth, the truth." His voice sharpened. "You call that truth? You turned your back on everything I built." "No," I said, calm but cutting. "You turned your back on me." He stepped closer. "I was hard on you because I wanted you to be strong." I laughed once quietly. "You threw me out, Dad. That's not strength, it's control." His face reddened. You have no idea what it took to build Monroe Estates. The sacrifices, I know exactly what it took, I said, interrupting. It took everyone else's silence. His jaw clenched. You're twisting things. I'm correcting them. We stared at each other, the room thick with 12 years of unsaid words. Finally, he sighed, the sound heavy with irritation and age. I didn't come here to fight. Then why did you come to settle this nonsense before it gets worse, he said. Langford's furious about the acquisition falling through. He feels blindsided. That's his problem, I said. He should have done his homework before trying to buy something that wasn't for sale. You embarrassed me, he said flatly. No, Dad, I said, voice low. You embarrassed yourself when you signed your name to a deal you didn't own. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. You've made your point. I walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from him. Not yet. He turned back, eyes narrowing. What is this you expect me to apologize? I don't expect anything, I said. I just want you to see the result of the story you started. He frowned. You really think one article changes the past? No, I said. But it exposes it. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Anger, maybe shame, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He straightened his coat. You're playing a dangerous game. The difference, I said, is I wrote the rules. He stared at me for a long moment. Then with a sharp exhale, he said, Fine. You've made yourself clear. I'll go. Before he could reach the door, I spoke again. You'll stay. He froze. Excuse me. You'll stay for the family reunion, I said. Check-in's at 3. His expression darkened. You're inviting me to your own party, I'm reminding you, I said. You're already on the guest list. Everyone is. His lips pressed into a thin line. You're trying to humiliate me. No, I said softly. I'm trying to let you experience what it's like to be welcomed into a home that isn't yours anymore. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low. You've changed. That was the point, I said. He nodded slowly, something bitter twisting in his smile. Be careful, Isabella. You're playing with legacy. No, I said. I'm rewriting it. He turned without another word and walked out, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway. I waited until the elevator doors closed before exhaling. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was the release that comes after years of holding your breath. Sienna appeared in the doorway moments later. Did he? He showed up, I said. That's enough. She hesitated, reading my face. You're shaking, only on the inside. She crossed her arms. You really told him to stay. He needs to see it, I said. All of it. Sienna's eyes softened. You think he'll ever understand? I looked out the window, watching the tide roll in, slow and deliberate. Understanding isn't the goal. Seeing is. The sky outside had turned a pale silver sunlight, cutting across the water in sharp lines. The world looked calm again, deceptively so. After Sienna left, I sat alone for a while, listening to the hum of the air vents, the distant chatter of staff preparing for the upcoming gala. On the wall behind my desk hung a framed blueprint of Solara's first building, the lines smudged from the years I'd kept it folded in my bag. I traced the frame with my fingertips and whispered, You were wrong, Dad. Emotion doesn't ruin structure, it gives it meaning. Later, as dusk fell, I walked down to the main ballroom. The chandeliers had been polished, the floors gleamed like glass, and garlands of white orchids framed the windows. At the center of the grand table sat a single golden nameplate that read, Owner the Forgotten Sister. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal against my skin. The reflection in its surface was sharp, bright, unflinching. 12 years ago, I'd walked away from his table into a night full of snow and silence. Now he'd be sitting at mine, and this time he would see exactly what his absence had built. I set the nameplate back down, straightened it carefully, and smiled. Tomorrow, the reunion would begin. Tomorrow, the past would walk through my doors and finally see the view from the other side. The first car arrived just after 10 in the morning, black paint gleaming under the December Sunday. From my office window, I watched as the line of SUVs curved up the palm-lined driveway, like a procession heading toward judgment. The staff waited outside in crisp uniforms, their smiles rehearsed, their movements precise. Christmas music drifted faintly through the open lobby, cheerful and unaware of the history about to walk through its doors. I stayed where I was, behind the tinted glass of the executive balcony, invisible but omnipresent. It felt fitting. Charles Monroe stepped out first. Even after all these years, he carried the same deliberate confidence, the straight back, the unhurried stride of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. His gray linen suit was immaculate, his expression carved from the same stone that once built my exile. Eleanor followed, quiet and graceful, a soft smile plastered over nervous eyes. Nathan came next, phone in hand, already recording, as if the world needed to know where he was. Chloe trailed behind him, her designer sunglasses catching the light, her voice rising as she admired the fountain. The concierge approached with champagne flutes. "Welcome to Solara Clearwater Bay," he said warmly. "Your suites are ready." Charles looked around the marble lobby, his gaze sweeping over the cascading chandelier, the carved coral panels, the gold lettering on the far wall, "Solara Light After Darkness." "This place is extraordinary," he said almost grudgingly. Eleanor nodded, her voice soft. "It feels familiar." Nathan grinned. "I read about this resort online. It's run by some young woman, supposedly self-made. Can you imagine what the owner makes?" The irony almost made me laugh. Grace Donovan appeared beside the front desk, clipboard in hand, her professionalism impeccable. "Welcome to Clearwater Bay. We're honored to host your family this Christmas. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your suites." Charles raised an eyebrow. "You're the manager, I'm the event director," Grace said. "The owner prefers to stay behind the scenes." He nodded approvingly. "Smart woman. Let the staff work while she collects the profit." Grace smiled politely. "Something like that." As she led them through the grand corridor, I followed their reflection in the glass, each of them pausing to admire the framed photos of Solara's opening ceremonies, the awards, the newspaper clippings. None of them noticed the faint signature at the bottom of each plaque, "Isabella Monroe, founder and CEO." When they reached their suites, the bellman opened the doors to reveal ocean views stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. On the nightstand sat a small handwritten note addressed to the guests. It read simply, "Welcome home." She smiled at it, unaware that the handwriting was mine. I stayed hidden for most of the day, walking the perimeters of the villa, listening to the orchestra rehearsing in the ballroom below. The gala preparations were almost complete, candles, crystal gold linen, every detail chosen with ruthless precision. At 6:30 sharp, I stood at the top of the grand staircase. Below me, the Monroe family entered the ballroom to polite applause. Guests in evening wear mingled, unaware of the undercurrent swirling through the room. The chandeliers sparkled, the orchestra shifted from jazz to a waltz, and the entire scene glowed like a photograph from a life that was never mine. Charles was laughing with Nathan near the bar, drink in hand, radiating charisma for an audience that didn't know the story behind his polished smile. Eleanor stood nearby, her posture elegant but uneasy. I waited, letting the music rise and fall until the moment felt right. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin tonight's program, please join me in welcoming the founder of Solara Clearwater Bay." The room turned toward the staircase as I stepped into the light. I heard the collective gasp before I saw their faces. Eleanor's glass slipped from her hand. Nathan froze mid-sentence, his mouth open. Chloe blinked, whispering something I couldn't hear. And Charles went perfectly still, color draining from his face. I descended slowly, my white gown catching the light, every step deliberate. The orchestra faltered for half a beat before continuing softer now, like the room itself was holding its breath. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I raised my glass and smiled. "Welcome to Solara," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the marble and glass. "Welcome home." No one spoke. Cameras flashed. The silence was almost holy. Eleanor's lips parted. "Isabella, I nodded slightly. It's good to see you, Mother. Nathan looked between us, stunned. You own this, built it, I said. Brick by brick. Charles found his voice at last. This is your doing. Everything you see, I said calmly, exists because of the night you told me to leave. His expression hardened. You're making a spectacle of yourself. I smiled faintly. No, Father. I'm hosting a celebration. You're the guests. The orchestra began to play again, but no one danced. Every eye in the ballroom was on us. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for her husband's arm. Charles, he ignored her, his voice sharp. You think this changes anything? You're still a Monroe. No, I said. I'm a Monroe by blood. Solara is mine by choice. That's the difference. The words hung between us, bright and cold. Nathan cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe we don't, I said softly. Not tonight. Charles exhaled slowly, his pride bending but not breaking. You've made your point. Not yet, I replied. I turned toward the crowd, raising my glass higher. 12 years ago I was told I didn't belong at my family's table, so I built my own. Tonight you're sitting at it. Applause broke through the tension, hesitant at first, then stronger. Guests clapped, unsure but moved, swept up in the spectacle of it all. Charles looked around, trapped by the attention he once commanded. He adjusted his tie, the gesture small but telling. Eleanor whispered something I couldn't hear. Nathan stared at the floor. I lowered my glass. You taught me that home is earned, I said quietly. So I earned mine. For the first time, my father didn't have an answer. The orchestra swelled and the room began to breathe again. People turned back to their conversations, the spell breaking slowly. I walked away from them, my gown trailing like smoke across the marble. From the edge of the room, I looked back once. Charles stood motionless, his reflection fractured in the mirrored wall behind him. Eleanor's eyes glistened, caught between pride and grief. Nathan met my gaze, then looked away. Outside, the night shimmered over the ocean, the air cool and electric. I stepped onto the terrace, the music fading behind me, and let the wind whip through my hair. The moment wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about revelation. They had finally seen what I'd become, and that was enough. When I turned back toward the ballroom, I caught sight of the nameplate at the head table, Owner the Forgotten Sister. For the first time, I didn't feel forgotten at all. The night of the Christmas gala unfolded like a dream balanced on the edge of a knife. Every chandelier glittered with crystal light, every table shimmered under gold-trimmed linen, and every guest wore their best mask of admiration and envy. The ballroom pulsed with warmth and music, but underneath it all the air buzzed with unspoken tension, especially at the table in the center where the Monroe family sat under the soft halo of a spotlight. I stood near the back, watching them before the cameras began rolling. Charles Monroe, in his black tuxedo, shoulders, rigid smile forced. Eleanor beside him, beautiful as ever, but distant, her hand trembling slightly each time she lifted her wine glass. Nathan and Chloe whispered nervously, pretending to admire the decorations, pretending not to notice the invisible fracture cutting through the family. Sienna appeared at my side, tablet in hand. Everything's ready, she said quietly. Press donors, live stream. Olivia Trent's team is already setting up for the interviews. I nodded. Good. Make sure the press stays near the east side when the segment starts. Sienna hesitated. You really want to do this on camera? This isn't about exposure, I said. It's about truth. Before she could reply, the host took the stage, his voice echoing across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Solara Clearwater Bay Christmas Charity Gala, hosted by our founder, Isabella Monroe. Applause rippled through the room, cameras flashing in every direction. I stepped forward, smiling for the crowd, letting the light hit my face just long enough for them to see the calm I'd learned to wear like armor. Tonight, the host continued, we also celebrate family legacy and the spirit of forgiveness. In fact, we have a special reunion in the house. Please join me in welcoming the Monroe family together again after 12 years. The orchestra softened. The applause turned hesitant. Charles's jaw tightened. Eleanor's hand froze halfway to her lap. Perfect, I walked toward their table, the silver of my gown catching the chandelier light, each step echoing in the silence. When I reached them, I placed my hand gently on the back of my father's chair. "Good evening," I said. Charles forced a smile. "You really do know how to command a room." "I learned from the best," I replied. Olivia Trent appeared beside us, microphone in hand, her crew fanning out with cameras and lights. "Miss Monroe," she began cheerfully, "first of all, congratulations. You've turned Solara into one of the most successful resort chains in the country. But tonight seems even more personal. What does it mean to celebrate Christmas with your family again?" I looked straight into the camera. "It means that time doesn't erase truth," I said. "It only gives you the strength to speak it." The crowd quieted, sensing something shifting. Olivia turned slightly toward my father. "Mr. Monroe, as the patriarch of such an influential family, how does it feel to see your daughter achieve this level of success?" Charles's expression didn't move. "We're very proud of Isabella," he said, his voice controlled. "She's always been driven. We've supported her from the start. The lie hung between us heavy as lead." I smiled, faintly keeping my eyes on the crowd. "That's generous of you, Father." Though I remember support feeling a little more conditional. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Olivia hesitated, then leaned in. "Would you like to elaborate?" I turned back to the camera. 12 years ago, on Christmas Eve, I told my family I wanted to start my own business. My father told me I was naive. He said women like me didn't build empires, they married into them. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. I continued, my tone steady, deliberate. That night I was told to leave my home. No money, no inheritance, just a suitcase and a promise that I'd fail. Charles shifted in his chair. "This isn't the time. It's exactly the time," I said, cutting him off. "Because tonight isn't about blame, it's about closure." "Eleanor," whispered Isabella, "please." But I wasn't speaking to her anymore. I turned back to the guests, to the cameras, to every woman and man who'd ever been told they weren't enough. "I built Solara from the ground up," I said. "Not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove that light can grow even from exile. That strength doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from surviving the moment you're not." The room erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous. The sound rolled through the hall like a wave breaking. The chandeliers trembled in their mounts. Olivia stepped back, eyes wide but bright. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice barely audible over the clapping, "that might be the most powerful statement we've heard all year." I turned slightly, meeting my father's gaze. His face was pale, unreadable. His fingers tightened around his glass. For the first time, he looked smaller, not because he was defeated, but because the world no longer revolved around him. Lance Whitmore took the stage, then, microphone in hand, his presence steady and commanding. "Every year," he began, "we honor a visionary who has reshaped what leadership means. This year's recipient built more than a business. She built a haven for others, Isabella Monroe. It's my privilege to present you with the Businesswoman of the Year award." The applause surged again as I stepped forward. The award glimmered under the stage lights, a crystal flame mounted on marble, heavy and perfect. When Lance handed it to me, I felt the cool weight of it against my palms. "Thank you," I said, turning to the crowd. "This means more than I can say." I paused, letting the applause fade into a hush. "I used to think justice was about winning," I said softly. "About proving people wrong, about standing higher than the ones who hurt you. But tonight, I understand it's something quieter. Justice is the moment you no longer need their approval to stand tall." I lifted the award slightly, its light reflecting across the room. "This is for everyone who was ever told they didn't belong. You already do. You just haven't built your Solara yet." The audience rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. Somewhere in the front row, I saw Eleanor crying openly, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Nathan clapped harder than anyone, his eyes glinting with something that looked like pride. Chloe reached across the table to squeeze his hand. And Charles sat very still, staring at his folded hands. The applause washed over him, and for the first time he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a man finally seeing the reflection of what he'd created and what he'd lost. As the music swelled again, I turned toward the window behind the stage. Beyond the glass, the ocean shimmered under the moonlight, calm and infinite. For 12 years, I'd dreamed of this night of a victory, loud enough to drown out the past. But standing there, I realized the silence inside me felt more powerful. Forgiveness wasn't the reward. Freedom was. I glanced back toward my father one last time. Our eyes met briefly, wordlessly. He didn't look away this time. The orchestra began a slow reprise of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. The guests swayed glasses, raised voices soft with admiration. I stepped off the stage, the award still warm in my hands, and whispered to no one in particular, Merry Christmas, Dad. You finally taught me what legacy really means. And for the first time in 12 years, I felt completely at peace. The morning after the gala broke clean and bright, the kind of light that seemed to forgive everything it touched. From the balcony of my suite, I watched the sea stretching out in shades of pale blue and silver, the sunlight catching the edges of the waves like glass. Down below, the staff was already bustling about, resetting the breakfast terrace, arranging flowers, greeting families who lingered for one last holiday morning. The resort felt lighter, as if it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for 12 years. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee and looked at the award sitting on the table beside me. The crystal flame caught the sun, scattering tiny fragments of color across the wall. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like peace. For once, I didn't feel the need to check my phone to read the headlines or the emails flooding in. Last night had said everything that needed to be said. The world could talk all it wanted, my voice had already been heard. A soft knock sounded at the door. Come in, I said. Sienna stepped in, her expression unreadable. They're here, she said gently. My pulse stilled for a moment, but I nodded. Send them in. Charles entered first, followed by Eleanor, Nathan, and Chloe. No photographers, no publicists, no audience, just family. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the ocean outside. Charles looked different, smaller somehow. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath the weight of something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe. Or realization. We came to say thank you, he began, voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to let the silence stretch to make space for something real. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward. You made something beautiful, Isabella, she said softly. We should have believed in you. I should have. I met her eyes. You didn't have to. I learned how to believe in myself. Charles's jaw tightened, then loosened again. I was wrong, he said finally. About you. About what it means to build something that lasts. You didn't need my approval. I never did, I said, not cruelly, just honestly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, I saw a snow globe inside a miniature version of Solara Clearwater Bay. Inside the glass, a tiny villa stood on a curved stretch of sand, glitter swirling around it like a silent storm. I bought it from your gift shop, he said. Thought you might like it. I smiled faintly, turning it in my hands. You built with money, I said quietly. I built with memory. I guess we're even now. His lips twitched, almost a smile. Maybe. Eleanor brushed a tear from her cheek. Maybe next year, she said gently. You'll come to Christmas because you want to, not because you have something to prove. I didn't make promises. I simply reached out and took her hand. The gesture said more than words ever could. Nathan cleared his throat. We've been talking, he said. Chloe and I found a property in Santa Barbara. Small, sustainable, near the ocean. We thought it could be the next Solara. We want to invest. I blinked, surprised. You want to be part of this? He nodded. Not as Monroes, as family, as people who finally understand what you built. For the first time, my heart softened without resistance. Then, let's make it happen, I said. Sienna entered with coffee, pausing as she saw us gathered together around the table. My father standing quietly, my brother handing me a folder, my mother smiling through tears. She looked at me, her eyes glimmering with relief. "You did it," she whispered when we stepped aside later. "No," I said. "We did." The afternoon unfolded gently. No tension, no sharp words. Just small talk, the kind that felt strange but hopeful about the weather, the guests, the expansion plans. When they finally left, the silence they left behind didn't hurt anymore. It just felt calm. By evening, the resort glowed again under strings of soft amber lights. A smaller dinner was held in the ballroom. No cameras, no speeches, just staff, a few local families, and quiet laughter echoing off the walls. The orchestra played low and sweet, the same melody from the night before, but slower now, more human. I walked through the room greeting guests, pausing by tables, feeling the rhythm of something I'd spent half my life chasing: belonging. Grace stood by the entrance laughing with the chefs. Sienna adjusted a centerpiece and winked at me. At one corner, Nathan was helping a guest find her seat, and in another, I saw my parents dancing. Slow, unsteady, but real. I stepped out onto the terrace for air. The ocean shimmered below the wind, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. For a long time, I just stood there watching the lights reflect on the water, thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who left home with a suitcase and a dream. After 12 years, I finally came home. Not to the family that cast me out, but to the one I built myself, the people who believed, who stayed, who helped me turn pain into purpose. I lifted the snow globe to the light. Inside, the tiny resort sparkled under swirling glitter. For the first time, it looked peaceful, not haunted. Sienna joined me on the balcony holding 2 glasses of wine. She handed me one and nodded toward the ballroom. "They're calling for you," she said. "Let them wait a minute," I replied. "I like this view." She smiled. "You always did." We stood there together, the laughter from inside mingling with the sound of waves. I turned the snow globe once more and said quietly, "You know, sometimes revenge isn't about winning. It's about finding peace in the place they thought would break you." Sienna looked at me. "So is this peace?" I smiled. "No, this is better. This is freedom." She laughed softly, bumping her glass against mine. "Then I'll drink to that." The music swelled from inside, familiar and gentle. I set the snow globe down on the railing, watching the flakes swirl inside one last time before settling. Maybe that's what healing really is. The moment the storm finally slows enough for you to see what you've built. I turned toward the camera then, as if finally breaking the fourth wall, my voice calm but intimate. If you've ever been written out of your own story, maybe it's time to write a new one. I did, and I promise it's worth it. I paused the waves, whispering beneath my words. Tell me, have you ever faced something like that? Did you forgive or did you rebuild? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. The piano inside shifted into a brighter key. I smiled, stepping back toward the warm glow spilling through the doors. And if you believe that every story deserves justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because some stories, I said softly, begin right where the pain ends. I glanced over my shoulder one last time at the horizon fading into gold and silver. The snow globe shimmered on the railing, the tiny villa inside, glowing under the last light of the day. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel like the forgotten sister. I felt whole. And as the music rose behind me, I whispered, "Welcome home."